That's really the basis.
Well, also, I mean, I agree with you, but look at how the so-called left, the totalitarian left, will say never judge us. In fact, they call it censorship. If you disagree with them, that's now censorship. No, censorship is shutting them down, blocking them, but then all they do is judge all day and take the moral high ground on a high horse, telling us how to think. I mean, it's just so bankrupt.
Indeed it is, Alex. It's hypocritical. It's a terrible violation of our particular rights. You know, it's just like education. And unfortunately, you know, conservatives have bought into this for years. They've caused their own problems. In public education, all education should be competing because all education has values. It is completely inappropriate for even the majority to impose a Christian education or an evolutionary education or any type of specific education on other people. All people in education ought to pay for the education they have. You can have public schools, but only the users of those schools ought to pay for it. And people ought not to be penalized for taking their dollars elsewhere, so they can choose a non-evolutionary education, or they can choose to have Christian values. They can choose to pray in school if they want. But the left, of course, wants to, in the name of democracy, in the name of majority, to actually bind people to a view. And Christians, unfortunately, have said, you know, we want Christianity in our schools. And I say, they're not our schools. They are government schools. And once you give government the power to determine values by majority rule, what happens when the government becomes Marxist? Then the majority is Marxist, or if the majority becomes Marxist, then they have just as much right as you have claimed as a Christian to impose their ideology.
Exactly. That's why we do have the separation of church and state, but not in the way they distort it, to say a Christian can't be in school and have a Bible and say they're Christian, or have it on their book bag. No, it means the government can't select what the state-run religion is, whether it be atheism, Marxism, fake environmentalism. And notice they're now saying, we have socialist health care, so now we're going to decide what you eat and what you do because we're all paying for each other. It's a total trap. It is slavery.
It's the same thing with the safety laws, you know. Because the government decides to pay for indigent people who get hurt by motorcycles, for example, we can mandate that everybody has a motorcycle helmet because the public is being imposed upon by having to pay for uninsured people. It's a false paradigm. It's an unlimited extension of lawmaking power. Once you allow government to dictate what is good for you, there's virtually no limit to the ability to intrude in our lives. It must be forever prohibited in law. Of course, you know, the Constitution is utterly disregarded nowadays by the courts.
I want to get into some of the current issues with Joe Skousen and World Affairs Brief, one of the top privacy and security home builders, best-selling author, former Marine Corps fighter bomber pilot in the Vietnam era. Of course, his uncle was Cleon Skousen, who just joined us, the Naked Communist. And he's headed up some of the largest true conservative constitutional organizations in the country and watched this entire de-evolution. If I go back to the days of Barry Goldwater, that talked just like you, or the days of Ronald Reagan when he was, you know, a governor or running, he talked about the New World Order, Trilateral Commission, this plan. They then demonized it in Hollywood and movies and then made people think it didn't exist. And then now we see a reemergence, somewhat of an awakening, because they're now actually accelerating all this, and we see an outright demonization of the freedom movement, an attempt to cause civil unrest as the pretext to federalize police. We see power grabbing at an unprecedented level. I agree with you that it always takes longer than what people say. But at the same time, this massive turning up of the heat, ratcheting up. A, do you agree they're accelerating things? And then B, why do you think they're accelerating things so fast? Is it from a position of weakness or a position of strength?
Well, clearly they are accelerating things. It's not relative to us as much as it is to, as people become acclimated to accepting the new agendas put forth by the media, such as non-discrimination. It opens a floodgate. And all of a sudden, as I predicted clear back in the 80s on that television program, I said, you ban discrimination based on race, and it's going to be next, you know, based upon femininity. It's going to be weight control. It's going to be based upon sexual orientation. There's no limit to what they can start to do. So the acceleration really more is the fact that there is less resistance anymore because of the dumbing down of people. And boy, I'll tell you, it's an avalanche, but they still have a long way to go. And they still fear the revolt of the people if it becomes obvious to many more people than it is right now that there really is an actual conspiracy. And that's why they must denigrate conspiracy, because that is the key factor to waking up millions of people, is to realize there's a conspiracy in the media, in education, in all things. And that's why the media must silence all conspiracy believers and denigrate them openly. It's the key. It's not electing Republicans. The key is explain to people how very bad it is.
Because if you don't realize it's premeditated, it's a long-term plan, none of it will make sense. But once you admit that, you could spend the rest of your life reading globalist documents, globalist books, globalist statements. The scary part is it's not even hidden. But so much of the public refuses to admit they're being conquered. And then you add to it that we're being conquered by very wicked people. I've said this hundreds of times, Joel. If we were being conquered by a superior culture and we had a tyrannical culture, I would join with it. But I see the power elite locally and regionally joining with it as if they're winning. When you study this, it really is at its bottom destructive, hateful, death-filled, cancerous. I mean, how do you describe this system? Because as we get further into it and as I research it more, you really do come away with the fact that you're fighting pure evil. I mean, it really is the devil.
It is, and I've long talked about the satanic basis for the globalist movement. I mean, just if you look at what I call the generational effect, how does any single evil person start creating a system where you're going to develop over a century and a half two evil enemies like Russia and China and set them against the world and have an intermediate enemy like Hitler, take them down one at a time and create a global new world order through war and conflict? I mean, there's no human being who can see that far in advance, let alone project that kind of thing against his own best wishes. I mean, it has to be revelatory, it has to be satanic at its basis, just because of the long-term prognosis, the long-term plan and agenda that we see just going down like clockwork.
Fascinating.
Now, they do have setbacks occasionally, just like this Syria situation where, Kerry made that mistake at that London press conference, giving Syria the out to take down his chemical weapons, and it set back the globalist agenda for a year and a half. They had to create ISIS in response in order to have an excuse to get back in, and they're in the process of taking down Syria with ISIS. I'm covering in the World Affairs Brief tomorrow, for example, how fellow fighter pilots like myself, modern ones, are complaining they're not allowed to attack actual people on the ground. Empty buildings, yes. In other words, this whole air attack against ISIS is false.
So, Smokescreen, stay there. I want to come back and give you the floor on that. That'll lead us into geopolitical, all of it. How big a deal is that the Defense Intelligence document came out to Judicial Watch admitting 3 years ago that they were creating the Al-Qaeda ISIS forces. But when we come back first, I want to get back with Joel Skousen, joelskousen.com, worldaffairsbrief.com, into when was it in your life when you came face-to-face in research, studying it, or did you have this moment like I had, when you realized, oh my gosh, it really is true, I believed it, but now I know it, there is a devil, you study it so much, you look at it, you know you're now looking at Satan, and it's chilling to really know it's all true, it is a spiritual battle, this planet is a test, it's so epic. Stay with us. Our guests, we're going to get into the Al-Qaeda situation, the ISIS situation. You can pull up mainstream news articles that finally came out, thank God, where Defense Intelligence admitted they funded Al-Qaeda groups out of Saudi Arabia and ISIS to topple Assad. That's all admitted. I mean, we've had the Tosh Plumlee whistleblowers and people on talking about the shipments. And believe me, the Justice Department starts calling us and showing up when we do these interviews. I mean, this is real. It's like Skousen always says, you got real whistleblowers? The feds show up. Well, guess what? They do. The only reason we're still on air is by the grace of God. I'm here to tell you, I know we have protection. And again, ladies and gentlemen, I grew up a Christian, but, when you're a teenager and stuff, you have your doubts. but I always had a spiritual connection to God and had a lot of interesting experiences in my life, so I knew there was a spiritual realm. But studying this, getting deeply into it, looking at it, seeing how through different people and different institutions, there's the mystery of evil the Bible talks about, this manifestation. And the globalists hurt their own interest so they can hurt the planet, the genetic code of humans. The devil is against free will if you read the Bible. The devil is against free will, but sells you that he's going to give you free will. Well, no, the devil just gives you knowledge. I mean, they had knowledge in the Garden of Eden. They had knowledge. They weren't idiots. They had free will to eat the apple. It's just they didn't have knowledge of evil thought processes. For me to be able to understand evil and study it, you get into the mind of it, as Nietzsche said, look out when you look into the abyss, lest you become the abyss, or don't dance with the devil because you can become the devil. Let me tell you, studying this 25 years, getting close to it, having to get into the mindset of the system, it's, make sure you got a strong will. That's why I get angry and upset over the years, because I'm spiritually awake and aware. Doesn't mean I'm perfect. I'm a worldly, fleshly person like anybody else. It's very upsetting, though, to be awake and conscious and to know the enemy's there hurting people, and I'm like an animal struggling in a cage trying to get out. And I want everybody else to want to struggle with me to get out, because God gives us free will and all these blessings. You follow God's promises. I'm not trying to be a preacher, because they won't preach this now. They've been taking over most major churches. You get blessed. The problem is you get so blessed, you become spoiled. So it's a paradox of free will. But at least my heart points towards God and justice. People that revel in evil, though, and I see the spirit spreading. Good is spreading, but evil is also spreading. And I'm afraid to say evil is spreading faster, as Joe Skousen said. Not even so much evil. It's like the grand delusion is here, the great delusion, where the people aren't there. They're in a trance. Joel Skousen, I'm going to shut up now, let you finish up with free will, the whole spiritual nature, because I think it's important to go to the bottom of the rabbit hole, then get into ISIS, Al-Qaeda, geopolitics, Sorosing, World War III, the South China Sea. I want you to move around the world in the next 25 minutes or so before we end the hour. Joel Skousen.
Well, speaking of on the spiritual process, I perhaps got most of my inclination about understanding things through the promptings of conscience. You know, people don't give enough attention to the workings of conscience in their mind because it's actually very judgmental. One of the signs of false religion is this unconditional loving God, this non-judgmental. It's really Satan's voice infiltrating the church when they preach those doctrines. God, yes, he can love, and it's actually fairly conditional, even though he has an outstretched arm to people. But it's very judgmental. If you listen to conscience, there are warning signals, nervous feelings that you'll get when you're reading a news story telling you something's not quite right here. And that's how I work through the World Affairs Brief. You know, I'm a small two-man shop. I don't have a big staff, but I can detect, because of my attention to the workings of conscience, when I'm reading disinformation or when there's falsehoods there. And I'm not saying it's perfect. You always have to struggle. It's not like you're getting direct revelation, but you know, you get that little tap on the shoulder and it says,
well, you're using your world knowledge, your understanding, your lens, and then you're putting your gut or your spirit, your discernment as the final meter.
That's right. And what I'm saying is, I think we're losing the battle in large part because even our conservatives are trying to work by rules rather than tap into the spiritual source that can direct us more specifically than a rule-making approach or a generalist approach. You know, things are so much more complex than just restore the Constitution. Heck, the lawyers don't mind if we restore the Constitution. They know how to interpret it because there's hundreds of thousands of case law. And so we really have to get beyond these banner-type slogans and get down to real understanding of the way that human beings operate, why we're being undermined, and how we save our children. You know, Dr. Creekmore of survivalblog.com did a survey of survivalists and preppers and said, where do you get your news source? And he was shocked because Alex Jones was down in number 4 position. He expected these people to be very, very, you know, up on this. And guess what was first? Fox News. And I look back and I think, how many of my clients, that I've worked for over the years designing high security residence retreats, I walk into their home and they're watching Fox News. In fact, they have it on all day long. Or Glenn Beck was number 2. And these are glitzy